Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, debt limit bill and other policy news you might have missed, from AI to WOTUS and prescription drug pricing. Joining us to discuss all of this is AAF President Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, thanks for joining us.
Always happy to be here.
So before we get into everything we want to talk about today, as usual, we want to all hear about what's on your mind this week. Tell us.
Greedflation.
Okay.
Greedflation is the notion that the inflation we're experiencing is due to companies increasing their profit margins, and so they're just pushing up their prices and pocketing the money. And this came up in a Bloomberg interview yesterday, and the problem is it's at odds with all the facts. Inflation is a broad economy-wide rise in prices, and we are not seeing a broad economy-wide rise in profits. Indeed, they're going the other direction. And none of it fits the pattern of inflation in recent years. We had goods inflation first. That's largely been cured. Now we have services inflation, and you just don't see that pattern in the profitability. So this is one of these sort of populist, progressive left notions where we're just going to blame big companies for everything, but it doesn't make any sense. And because it doesn't make any sense, it makes me frickin' nuts.
That usually seems to be a theme with your rants, but I mean, it really does seem like it's been the talking point of a lot on the left recently, where when they talk about inflation, well, this isn't Biden's fault, this is greedy corporations and then other world events that are happening, type of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this when inflation first hit, they trotted this out of the White House. They ran this notion this is all just big corporations, as if the era of corporate benevolence had finally ended. I mean, that never existed. If they could raise their prices, they would have raised the prices.
Yeah. So anyways, this is a rare back-to-back podcast that we're recording these days, but I think there was something that happened this week that we should probably talk about.
It's half happened.
Yeah, so half happened. So the House passed the so-called Fiscal Responsibility Act, the agreement between President Biden and Speaker McCarthy to suspend the debt limit until January of 2025, among other things. So first, give us a run us through the key highlights of this bill.
Number one, it suspends the debt ceiling. If passed by the Senate, signed by the President, avoids any risk of a default and impairing the credit worthiness of treasuries. That's the highlight, no question. Number two, it doesn't do much to the fiscal outlook. It never could. The things that matter the most, the big entitlement spending programs, were off the table. And so, yes, they made some modest progress, but they were looking at the wrong part of the budget. And number three, it's not just a budget bill. Unlike many of these things, this has a lot of non-budgetary policy in there, whether it's work requirements for some of the social welfare programs or permitting reforms or administrative pay-go. There's a lot in here that is really policy objectives by the parties involved.
Yeah, so getting to this compromise was no easy task. I mean, it took them months and months and months to get here. So understandably, a lot of the provisions in here have more to do with, placating key members of groups rather than meaningfully address the fiscal challenges, as you notice. What's your take on the significance of this bill, and what's it addressing? What's the dressing here? What's the window dressing?
I mean, look, the most important thing about the bill is we did not melt down the global financial system. Good.
Yeah.
The rest, whatever it takes to get to 218 votes in the House and 60 in the Senate, honestly.
Yeah.
And so, like work requirements, that became a red line as enunciated by Speaker McCarthy. The work requirements are modest and temporary. Mm-hmm. So it's not as if there's a transformation of these programs. There's a tweak to them for the next 5 years. Yeah. And then we move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said this like about 100 times on Twitter now, just following what, your responses to all this. And it's, at the end of the day, they're raising the debt limit. This is something that they had to get done, and everybody had agreed from the start that this was something that was essential to get done.
And in divided government, it's harder because you have to corral the votes, and as a result, there's no real way to predict what the final bill will look like. But it takes legislation to raise the debt ceiling, and so you start adding stuff in until you have the right mix, and off you go. And so it's looked very different over time.
Right. And then the other part of this is obviously now we have to move to the next branch of the legislature, that is the Senate. What happens there in your mind?
One of two things. Either they all concede the obvious and essentially hurry up the Senate process, which can be quite slow, get this done by the end of Friday night and go home, or we get some political theater, people wanting to amend the bill to make a point about one thing or another. Defense spending is too low. Senator Kaine from Virginia is unhappy about Manchin's pipeline getting preferential treatment. I mean, so you could see some protracted votes on amendments that will have to fail because if you amend it, it's got to go back to the House, and then we're out of time.
Yeah.
So political theater, all of which will fail, and it goes to the president for signature. The only question is when.
Yeah. So it sounds like that Senator Schumer will basically have to thread the line here with allowing these amendments to come to the floor, but making sure that it's just placating these members and making them happy with what, and then just getting this bill to the finish line.
My understanding is all of those amendments will be subject to a 60-vote threshold. And the chief job of the majority leader will be to make sure that nobody has 60 votes.
Except on final passage.
Yes.
All right, so let's take our break before we get into those policy areas that people might have missed the past couple of weeks, and do our favorite part of the podcast.
I didn't review the...
Yeah, this was from a couple weeks back, but I think you'll get this one because you've talked about it before. So after Dodd-Frank was enacted, the U.S. And prior to that, the U.S. banking system had averaged 137 new banks between 1990 and 2007. How many new banks did they average between 2011 and 2022? Correct.
5.
Yes, 5. So,
and there's some zeros in there.
Yeah.
Which is just stunning.
Yeah. So just quickly remind us what Dodd-Frank was. I'm assuming most people are familiar with it.
Hey, Dodd-Frank was a massive overhaul of the regulatory apparatus that surrounds banks in the United States, and it really had a lot of expensive compliance issues. And if it's costly to comply with something, it's hard to go into that business, right? The small banks have the least wherewithal to do that. They don't have armies of lawyers on retainer. They don't have the expertise in knowing how to minimize the impact on their business. And so it's just staring at us in the data. We passed Dodd-Frank, and what we now have is limited entry into banking. Entry is how you tame and control large banks. They have to face competition, or they will have some power. And so I think we ought to be thinking hard about getting more people into the banking business.
Yeah, and this is all back in the news because of the mid-sized banks' failures that have been happening in the economy.
On a bipartisan basis, during the Trump administration, Congress decided that, maybe this was right. It was too expensive to get into business. For the smaller regional banks, let's minimize those compliance costs a little bit. And so they scaled back the apparatus. And now it's a convenient talking point to point to that and say that's why we got the Silicon Valley Bank, not Silicon Valley Bank was the worst run bank in the history of history. Yeah. Which is probably closer to the truth.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, what's happening in that industry recently? I mean, it seems like no news is good news. And
what's happened in that industry recently is interest rates stayed at 0 for a decade, and they forgot how to manage interest rate risk. So all of the interesting developments this year have to do with interest rates going up and getting unawares of the need to manage their portfolios, match the sort of maturity of their holdings to the liquidity needs of their customers, things like that.
All right. Interesting. All right, let's move on. So while, the debt limit has obviously been the big news of the week, the past couple of weeks, and it's really sucked the oxygen out of the room for the policy room the last couple of weeks. But there's been some movement in some other policy areas that I think are worth noting and worth talking about. The Senate recently held 2 hearings on artificial intelligence back in May. What did we learn from those hearings?
Well, I think one of the things we learned, and the point I made when I wrote about this, is AI is very trendy right now. Everyone's all ginned up to either win the AI race with China or protect humanity from AI, which is out to get us, and so everybody's gotten into the AI business. It's probably a mistake because number one, not all AI is created equal. There are lots of different kinds of AI. Chat GPT is the poster child of this, but that's something known as a generative AI. It can create new products, images, writing from existing data. Not all AI is like that. We met with some folks who do predictive AI. They're trying to predict what's the best match between someone coming into a call center and their service representatives. And in real time, they sort of look at what's going on and try to match them up to improve the customer's experience in that effort. So that's a very different animal. And so that point number one is, let's be real clear about what we're trying to regulate. They're not all the same, and it won't work if we have a one-size-fits-all regulatory apparatus. Second thing is that we have a lot of ability already to regulate AI. I mean, there's this notion that somehow this is completely new, different, and we're unprepared, and it's just running wild in the world. No, go back to the example with call centers. We have regulations for consumer protection. We have regulations for privacy. We have all sorts of regulations for products and services in the economy. AI is usually an input to those products and services, and it will fall naturally into some regulatory framework. And if it needs to be beefed up because of a new kind of input, fine. But that's how it will happen, not across the board one big AI regulation.
Yeah, I think I think AI can be a helpful tool in a lot of areas, like, the chat GPT and things like that. But, it seems to me that between the movies out there and
Sure.
all of these CEOs coming out and saying we need to pause AI and things like that it's causing a lot of more fear than is needed, and everyone's conflating all of the different areas in this.
And to my eye, at least, it's much more evolutionary than people appreciate. Like, we have had things in word processors that want to complete your sentence for you for a long time.
Yeah,
that's a very simple form of AI. We've had computer-generated images in CGI in films for a long time. The question is how much of it can be done without direct human input. So more now than before, but you're still directing the AI. So it's not that there will be no issues. I'm sure there are going to be some important issues, but let's identify them as they actually arise and deal with them appropriately.
Gotcha. So the Supreme Court also made a ruling on an AAF favorite.
Oh, yes.
The waters of the United States, or the WOTUS rule. Why is this issue important, and what did we learn from the Supreme Court decision? Because that was a confusing decision.
Yes. So the waters of the U.S. Is the rule that's put out by the Environmental Protection Agency and also the Army Corps of Engineers, which defines the waters that are to be regulated by the EPA under the Clean Water Act. And the poster child for the problem is sort of wetlands. Like, when does this little swamp in my backyard become something the EPA has a fair shot at, and when does it not? There have been lawsuits on this forever because it's essentially a sweeping nationwide land use rule, and some of those things you can't do. And so this particular case was some property owners who had been told they couldn't do a development in a wetland they owned, and they took it to the Supreme Court, and they got a 9-0 decision that said you cannot regulate them, that they're free of the EPA, and that made it sound like, oh, this is all now settled. We know what's in, what's out. 9-0, that's the best you can get. Turns out that the justices agreed that in this case, clearly it did not apply, but did not agree about anything else. So this issue of like what constitutes a regulatory body, like there's one definition which is that was floated, which is there's a continuous connection between the wetland and some river, like it's an obvious water to be regulated. Not everyone buys that. It could be adjoining, or it could be some other sort of close, intermittent connection, and so we got a flurry of opinions with all sorts of interesting, conservative liberal crossovers to sign off the opinions. And I think we don't know now what the rules are going to be. They're going to have to go back, write another rule. It will probably be litigated. I pray it will not end up at the Supreme Court again, but you can't rule that out. And as in most cases where we're always seeing lawsuits and we're always seeing these sort of things tossed back to the agency, it's time for Congress to step in and say, clearly, in English in a statute what they want the rule to be. That's the solution.
I think a lot of this, I mean, you see this a lot where Congress sort of passes the buck off and allows the administration to write these rules, and then it comes up with these confusing situations where then we got to be like, common sense doesn't always apply to some of these things. So
you need a bright line or you end up with lawsuits. And the bright line might not make you happy, and that's why lawmakers don't want to draw that bright line. But in the end, there are some places, we've been litigating this since well before the Obama administration. It's time to just have the line drawn.
Yeah. All right. So finally today, let's talk about the recent actions on the Inflation Reduction Act's drug pricing provisions. AF's health team has recently written about this issue. Walk us through the latest happenings.
So the question is, what happens as a result of the IRA? The thing that gets the most attention is the drug price negotiation, of which I'm not a big fan. Let's put that aside. First thing that we looked at was how many people are really helped by this? It's advertised as like the greatest thing ever to happen to seniors. Well, as it turns out of the 65 million seniors, about 5.6 million, under 10%, are going to benefit from the immediate redesign of the Part D program. So that's not quite as impressive as one might have thought, and only half of those, actually 2 million, have substantial help. They're the ones who have the huge out-of-pocket costs. We put a cap on that; they benefit. So a little bit of help for a few people. That's really the message. Second is future attractions. One of the things that the Part D redesign did is it made the Part D plans, the insurers, responsible for a bigger chunk of the costs. Both in the catastrophic region, so if you have a very expensive patient, they're now paying a big chunk of that cost, used to be the taxpayer, and during the bulk of the benefits, so they have an incentive to not let people get into the catastrophic region as well. This is about a $40 billion hit to a collection of plans that had profits of $4 billion in the most recent year. So they're not just going to eat it. It's too big. So things are going to have to change. So you just start running down the sort of usual list of things that they might do to respond to this. They could raise their premiums to cover it. Unlikely. People hate premium increases in Part D, and the plans are really loath to do that. So now you go down the more complicated list. It's easier to manage costs if you have more levers. And so Medicare Advantage plans that have Part D in it are probably going to be advantaged relative to a standalone Part D plan, which really doesn't have as many levers to control the cost of care. So we're probably going to see fewer standalone Part D plans, more MAPD plans, so something like that. Second is that you can change the formularies to control the costs, and so people who are used to their plan and or used to the formulary in their plan are going to see both potentially change. They'll have to go find a new one. They can try to negotiate lower costs with manufacturers. That's actually one of the things that I think is a good thing about this. Force the private sector to negotiate fiercely, try to get the costs down. But if all that doesn't work, they're going to try to minimize utilization. So, you got to get authorization before you can take an expensive drug, things like that. The upshot is we should expect to see a fairly dramatic change in the landscape of the Part D program, which has, since its inception, had really high approval ratings and has been very successful. And I worry that one of the unintended consequences might be seniors being a bit grumpy about what's going on with their Part D program.
Interesting. Well, Doug, this is our last podcast for 2 weeks. We're taking a 2-week hiatus due to your various vacations and things like that. Tis the season, right? Summer's coming around the corner. Everyone wants to take a little bit of a break. And since we won't be around to talk about it, what should people be watching?
Well, certainly the next big policy issue is going to be the Fed at its June meeting. They've signaled pretty clearly by having the nominee to be the vice chairman, Philip Jefferson, say that it makes sense to skip a rate hike at that meeting and look at more data. So that's clearly the first thing is that decision. The second is the data. Like, when we look at the data, there isn't a lot of sign that demand is cooling. Demand is very high relative to supply in the economy, and inflation remains resilient as a result. So I think this is one of those times where you shift from looking at the policy, what's going on in the House, the Senate, the Fed, because not much is going to go on in those places, and instead look at the economy underneath and sort of look at the health of that as we go into the second half of the year, where there's been a lot of concern about a recession. So it's data time, and that's exciting for folks to get up every day and read the data. So this is my gift to you.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. Speaking of data, I mean, it was interesting. It was interesting to see the job openings number yesterday.
Yeah,
I mean Wednesday. Thrown off by not having Monday off, so I forget what day of the week it is. But that was a large number.
Yeah, so for the listeners, job openings and labor turnover is one of the surveys that the Labor Department does. And job openings are supposed to be going down, not up, as the labor market supposedly cools, and they bounced right up. And the quit rate stayed about the same. And so, we've got not a lot of evidence that the labor market slowed dramatically. And we got even more this morning. So keep looking at the data and figure out where we're going.
Well, I'm looking forward to your weekly economic tracker video later on today.
Yes, we'll do that in a little bit.
Perfect. Well, Doug, thank you for joining us and breaking this all down for us on a rare back-to-back podcast week.
My pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes, and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.